sponsors who you see on the screen here, and Mary Pham for all of the work she does behind the scenes to make reps work so smoothly. Remember that in March we're having two of these sessions. On March 16th, so 2 weeks from today, we're going to have a session with Dr. Greg Gonzalez from Yale, who was rescheduled from the fall. Dr. Gonzalez is really a remarkable person. He was a key player in the HIV activism movement. He's an epidemiologist at Yale and the 2018 winner of the MacArthur Genius Award. So he's going to be presenting on the role of patients and advocates in research. And then on April 6th, we're going to be hearing from our own Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy, Dr. Matt McCoy, with another perspective on patient engagement in research. And then just another quick, I should have gone through. So this is the rest of the schedule for the spring session. And a quick reminder about the online research ethics course that's been developed by the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy, available for free to learners at Penn and CHOP, and eligible to satisfy the human subjects training requirements. The course is also available to learners who are outside of Penn. It's free to learners in low and middle income countries. So please get in touch with me or Steve Jaffe if you are interested or you know audiences that we should potentially be reaching out to. Okay, so on to today's event. It's my pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Alison Bateman-House, who's going to be presenting today on expanded access and right to try, topics about which she is an internationally renowned expert, prolific author, and lecturer. Dr. Bateman-House is an assistant professor in the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Langone Health, where she co-chairs CUPA, the division's working group on compassionate use and pre-approval access, as well as the working group on pediatric gene therapy and medical ethics. She also leads several of NYU's compassionate use advisory committees, or compacts, which advise Janssen Pharmaceuticals on the allocation of investigational medicines to patients outside of clinical trials. Following Dr. Bateman-House's lecture, we're going to have commentary from Dr. Bob Vonderheide, who is the John H. Glick Abramson Cancer Center professor here at the Perelman School, as well as the director of the Abramson Cancer Center. Dr. Vonderheide's own lab works to advance the understanding of tumor immunology and to develop novel immunotherapies for cancer. And Dr. Vonderheide has been leading consideration of how the Cancer Center should approach right to try, which he'll discuss with us this afternoon. So thank you both for being here. Let me turn things over to Dr. Bateman-House, who I should mention is a very active tweeter. So if you're interested in tweeting along with this session, please use the hashtag #PennReps. Okay, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. This has actually been rescheduled so many times I can't remember. And of course, now that I finally got here to do it, I'm losing my voice. So I will be chugging my water. And if at any point you can't hear me, even with the microphone, just, gesticulate wildly at me and I'll figure out what you're talking about. So as Holly said, I co-chair two working groups. They're both up on the screen, and they both deal with access to investigational products. One is within trials and one is outside of trials. And what Holly did not say is she is a member of the group that deals with compassionate use and pre-approval access. She's our newest member, and we're super excited to have her. So you have your own renowned expert here as well. So today I'm talking specifically about expanded access and right to try, which are two pathways here in the United States for getting access to a drug that is not yet approved for any purpose outside of a clinical trial. So, normally if you get access to an investigational drug, it is in a clinical trial, but there's some situations in which, the trial is full or the trial is too far away or you don't meet the inclusion criteria, and that's what we're talking about today. And I just got back from DC where there was the Rare Diseases Week. I don't know how many of y'all were following. Yes, some people. And met with a bunch of stakeholders there in sort of, these private listening sessions about pediatric gene therapy. And the words that I came away with that I actually think deal as well with what we're talking about here today are desire for access, expectations, education, and transparency. So I'm going to come back to those at the end, but I'm just going to throw them out there now to sort of like lodge in your mind. But what I want to start with is a story, and I'm going to tell it hopefully quickly, but I think it's an important story for helping us, sort of understand these issues in sort of a, a real life way. So this is a boy named Josh Hardy. Josh Hardy was diagnosed with a rare kidney cancer as an infant, and he survived until he was, well, he is now dead. He survived until he was about 10, but at the time of this story, he was 7. And at 7, he was starting to suffer the aftermaths of the early treatment he had had as a baby. So he had undergone radiation, he had had chemotherapy, he had had a number of interventions, and now several years later, his body was taking a toll. So he actually had a bone marrow transplant as sort of an effort to, move forward with his care, and he developed adenovirus infection. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I understand that adenovirus infection is generally like your common cold, and normally your human body immune system would fight it off, maybe after a day or few of inconvenience. But in this case, he had no functioning immune system, and so Josh was dying. So he went to St. Jude's Medical Center, and the doctors tried any number of things, and they were not working. And one of his doctors did a lit search, which is what we're supposed to do when you're trying to figure out what other treatment options exist, and found that there was one case report of a case of adenovirus that had been successfully treated with an investigational broad-spectrum antiviral called brincidofovir. So the doctor suggested that, in lieu of other options, perhaps they would reach out to the company and ask for access to brincidofovir outside of a clinical trial, specifically through expanded access. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, this is, again, a regulatory pathwork that is set up because, generally speaking, it is illegal to use an unapproved drug in the United States. We make exceptions. One exception, the largest exception, is a clinical trial. The other sort of exception is for this expanded access or non-trial pre-approval, sort of therapeutic use. And there are rules, and one rule is that there has to be no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy to treat this patient. And I put up here diagnose, monitor, or treat just because I think that's important. In the current context, keep in mind that both Ebola and the coronavirus diagnostics were originally used through expanded access. So this is a pathway that is used more frequently than you would think, just not something that we're aware of. So expanded access, there has to be no other treatment available for this patient. That means either through enrolling in a clinical trial or through an approved product. And then there's some restrictions on who the eligible patients can be. So one is a patient with a life-threatening disease, which is the thing that we tend to think of when we think about compassionate use cases. And the other is a patient with, a serious disease. And serious is intentionally flexible. It was intended to give maximum flexibility. And I actually asked FDA one day if they had ever denied an expanded access request on the basis of it wasn't serious enough. And they said, no, serious is in the eye of the beholder. And if someone thinks it's serious enough that they want to chance an investigational product, then we're okay with that. So this is expanded access, and this is what the doctor was proposing using to get this broad-spectrum antiviral brincidofovir. Now, the company in question was Chimerix. It was a grand total of 55 people, which if those of you are familiar with companies like Janssen or Novartis or Pfizer, which are, like multinational, just Goliaths, you would know this is a tiny, tiny little company. It had no approved products, which meant basically it was dependent on investors buying stock to have money to do its research and activity. And brincidofovir was the only drug in its pipeline. And it did have a clinical trial underway, but it was for cytomegalovirus in adult hematopoietic cell transplant recipients, so not children with adenovirus, which is why they couldn't just enroll Josh in the clinical trial. Now, of note, Chimerix had previously had a compassionate use program and had given away quite a bit of its drug through this, but it had ended it. I'm just curious for sake of interactivity. Anyone have any idea based on those dates, 2009 to 2011, why they may have had a compassionate use program and then ended it for a broad spectrum antiviral? Very close, before SARS. MERS is afterwards. Smallpox. So I don't know if you remember, we were all terrified that, some non-state actor was going to weaponize smallpox and use it as a weapon of mass destruction, and the government was throwing money into smallpox-related research. Generally speaking, it's not ethical to give someone smallpox, so, we can't do a challenge study or something like that. So one of the sort of workarounds that they did is they said, well, a broad spectrum antiviral would theoretically address smallpox. So we're going to, test out these broad spectrum antivirals, not on smallpox, but on other things. And, if it seems to be very effective, then we'll put it in our, armory in case smallpox comes. And then like all scares, hopefully coronavirus could test this, but like all scares, this too came to an end, and we were not concerned about smallpox anymore, and the government funding dried up. The government funding was what was being used to run that compassionate use program, and so it ended. And by the time that Josh's request was conveyed to the company, they had denied over 300 requests just in that year. So there were a lot of requests coming in, and the company had said, we're a small company, we need to focus on bringing this drug to market. The funding that we had used to divert our person power and time and supply into compassionate use is gone, so we're not doing that anymore. And Josh continued to get worse. And so the doctor contacted Chimerix again and said, would you please reconsider? We really think that this is his only option. And the company again said, no, we're very sorry, but we're not making an exception for anyone. We've had numerous requests. We're just not doing it anymore. And I don't know what message the doctor and I've never spoken to the doctor who made the request, but I don't know what message that doctor conveyed to Josh's parents. But Josh's mother, is that readable? Not really, sorry, wrote a Facebook post. I'll read it to you. Our son, Josh Hardy, who recently had a bone marrow transplant, has developed the adenovirus. This is a deadly virus for people who have weak immune systems. There is a drug called brincidofovir that has been proved to treat the adenovirus effectively. Our doctor at St. Jude told us that they ran the study for the drug company, and he knows it will work. However, the drug company has refused to release the drug for compassionate care because they are trying to take it to market. Basically, they are not going to save a child's life for money. And I just underlined a couple of things here that you can, see the sort of perception that she had. He ran the study for the drug company, and he knows it's going to work. The underlining is not working. I don't know why my formatting is weird, but the other thing that was supposed to be underlined was been proved to treat the adenovirus effectively. So at least the perception she had is that this was a slam dunk. Her son was dying. There was something that was definitely going to help him, and she just couldn't get access to it. And in that case, I think many parents, it would be understandable why they would go to extreme lengths to get access for their children. In fact, many people go to extreme lengths to get access for things that are, not guaranteed to be slam dunks. In this case, it was perceived to be an absolute, slam dunk that this was going to save her son. So her cousin went to work on change.org and formed a petition. And I always have to note, just because this is like a reminder of how weird the world is, the cousin is from my hometown, which has like 3,000 people, so this is very strange. But anyway, so here's change.org. And this is where Richard Plotkin comes into the story. Richard Plotkin was a very successful New York-based trial attorney whose grandson had pediatric cancer. And he had decided that, I'm quasi-retired, I'm tremendously wealthy, and there's nothing better to do with my time and my money than to fight pediatric cancer. So he formed something called Max Cure. And the Facebook post that Josh Hardy's mother wrote trickled its way through the pediatric cancer advocacy community and landed on his desk. Now, Max Cure had a full-time social media person, and Richard said to her, make this go viral. And she was exceedingly successful, and it went viral. With pictures like this is Josh with his family, and you can see one of his brothers is wearing a t-shirt, Josh's Army, so everything was hashtag Josh's Army. It made it to the nightly news. And this is the sort of villain in the story. This is Ken Mock, who was the CEO of the drug company. Now, Ken is actually a personal friend of mine, and I've always told him that this picture does him no good because it makes him look like the archetypal smug, drug company, non-caring bastard. But anyway, that's the picture that was being circulated out there. And Ken was trying to make this case saying, it's not fair. It's not fair to change the rules for this one person simply because he's got people advocating on his behalf when we don't give it to anyone. And it would actually be unethical to break the rules simply because there's like a campaign in his behalf when, a bunch of other people don't have that sort of social media attention and audience. And that claim did not get any traction. So you can see this is Chimerix CEO Ken Mock is presenting at JP Morgan today, and you can see the comments. I don't know if you can read them. Chimerix, please help Josh and God bless you. Save Josh. People have offered to pay for the treatment. Make this a requirement for compassionate use cases. All caps. We are watching you. Save Josh. Chimerix, are you actually humans? Do you have a heart? I am shocked at how horrific your CEO is. Is he for real? Chimerix, so the set price of one child's life is $50,000 US. Is this what we are all reduced to now? This is why I didn't get an MBA. So, you can see the rumor mill rampantly at work. Chimerix never said, give us $50,000 and we'll give you this drug. But these are the sort of myths that took off. And this escalated, this sort of feeding frenzy. It went around the globe, professional sports stars were tweeting this, all sorts of people were chiming in, saying we need to save Josh at all cost. And Ken Mock got a call on his cell phone, and it said, we are the FBI, and there have been validated threats against your life and the lives of your family members, and we think you should take this seriously. And our recommendation is that you leave home and you check into a hotel room under an assumed name and stay there until we tell you otherwise. And you probably should pass that message to your board as well, because they are also the subject of threats. So Ken and his family did what they were told, and then several days later he got another call on his cell phone, and it was the FDA saying, hi, we saw everything that's happening on the news, and someone's going to get killed, and so we really strongly advise you to open a pediatric 10-person or small trial and make Josh your number one patient and give him the drug as quickly as possible to try to defuse this before someone dies. And so that's what they did. They did an open label study, which means, everyone knows what they're getting. Everyone's getting brimstadofovir. It was particularly in pediatric patients with adenovirus, and Josh Hardy was the first patient. And this was on the, internet celebrated as a great victory, and it was for Josh. But keep in mind, it was through the clinical trials process, which is, our sort of standard of how people would get access. And Chimerix fired Ken Mock, or as they say in this announcement, he has resigned to pursue other interests. So that is the story of Josh Hardy insofar as what hit the media. So what you're getting ready to see now is sort of the behind-the-scenes story. Because, remember, this was lauded as the success story. The combined advocacy efforts got Josh Hardy a drug, and he survived, and this wouldn't have happened otherwise. And Richard Plotkin got flooded by other patients and parents saying, do the same for me. So this is a letter he wrote me. I was asked to get involved in helping 3 other children with cancer obtain experimental drugs. I then realized how arbitrary the system is relative to the granting of compassionate use waivers by the FDA, and what an incredible burden is placed on those of us in the advocacy arena trying to help save the lives of children with cancer. Given what our group was able to assist in accomplishing for the Hardys, I realized we had within our power the ability and burden to help decide which children would be given a chance to live and which would continue on the path to premature death. Of the 3 children, these are like the first 3 that he got contacted about, I elected not to get involved in 2. In my limited world, I was making a decision as to who should live and who should die, a very uncomfortable position to be in. I realized that something must be done to establish a better system to determine who shall live and who shall die relative to the issuance of compassionate use waivers. So the sort of really unexpected coda to this story is that Richard Plotkin and Ken Mock went on to become best friends, because Richard Plotkin reached out and said, man, I totally demonized you for saying I'm not going to pick and choose who to give this drug to. And now I'm having to pick and choose who to give the support of my organization to, and it's not right. I shouldn't be doing that. There should be a better system. Let's work together and see if we can come up with something. And around this time, this is where we finally get to Right to Try. Holly's like, what does this have to do with Right to Try? This is when Right to Try appeared on the scene. And so Richard Plotkin called me and said, hey, there's this new thing out there, and maybe this is what we need to make access, more fair and equitable for all. And I said, I've never heard of it. Do you have any information? So he mailed me this book, and the sort of quiescence of the idea of Right to Try is in the subtitle, How the Federal Government Prevents Americans from Getting the Life-Saving Treatments That They Need. This is by Darcy Allison, president of the Goldwater Institute. Anyone know what the Goldwater Institute is? Goldwater Institute is a libertarian think tank based in Arizona, named for Barry Goldwater, who, to the best of my understanding, and I don't run in these circles, so I could be wrong, but to the best of my understanding, actually ended up asking them to take his name off of the institution because it was too sort of radical for him. So this is a very far off to the fringe libertarian organization. And what they did is they picked up this idea from the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, which Greg Gonzalez, I'm sure, will talk about at your next event, which is that the FDA is overprotecting people to death. So this is a very famous picture from one of these ACT UP demonstrations. If I die of AIDS, forget burial, just drop my body on the steps of the FDA. And at that point in time, that was a reasonable critique. There were very few pathways for you to get access to investigational medical product of any sort outside of a clinical trial. And the clinical trials available for HIV/AIDS were very few and far between. So, it was very few fortunate people who were able to get into the trials. And for the patients who were not able to get into the trials, they said, we have a fatal illness. It's very obvious where this ends, and you are condemning us to death because you're not giving us any other options. And this is where you've heard, I'm sure, of like the buyers clubs, which have been grossly fictionalized. But I mean, basically the idea of people saying there's other treatments outside of the United States that we want to try, and why shouldn't we be able to do that? So they picked up this idea that was, valid in the 1980s and said, okay, now it's 2014 and this is still the problem. And I'll just cut to the chase and say I don't actually think that's true, but let's go through their messaging for a moment. So this is a graphic that they put out, and they say, look at the FDA approval timeline. Now remember, we're not talking about FDA approval. Approval for drugs takes many, many, many years. But we're specifically talking about pre-approval access. So approval is sort of a side issue at this point. And they have this little graphic of the person in the wheelchair, and they say, we need Right to Try because after phase 1 studies, which prove safety, phase 1 studies don't prove safety, but there's a common misperception because they're called safety studies that the drug is now safe. If the drug is safe, we should let people be able to try it if they want to, and we need Right to Try in order to allow them to do that. Then they're in this tiny little text that's hard to read. They do sort of acknowledge that there is actually expanded access that has been allowing this for decades at this point. While hundreds of thousands of people died from terminal diseases last year, less than 1,000 were given permission to access experimental medications in the current system. For some patients, the process took so long that they died before they received the drugs or shortly after as their condition worsened. So there's a lot going on in that tiny little thing. So they're acknowledging expanded access exists, but they're saying it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because out of the entire nation, only 1,000 people were able to use it. Now, where did they get that number? They got that number because the FDA, as a public agency, has to keep track of the request it gets for expanded access. And so they keep track. It's publicly available on the internet. But what is missing here is they say 1,000 people. It was 1,000 requests, and about half of all requests are multi-patient requests. And when I say multi-patient requests, it literally can be anywhere from 2 patients to thousands of patients. So we don't know how many people it was. We know it was more than 1,000. And actually one of the things I would really like is I would really like us to have some sort of data to know how many people are getting access, but we don't have that currently. And then there's the claim that the process took so long that the patients died or were not able to help because it took so long. And there's a lot going on in there. Are you saying that the FDA took long? The FDA's role in this process? Because again, we have public records and that's not true. If it's an emergency request, generally the FDA turns it around same day. And if it's a non-emergency request, the FDA generally turns it in about 4 business days. Which, especially if you're thinking about shipping drug from a manufacturer to a hospital site, I mean, it's not going to be happening, much faster than that anyway. And then finally, there's this claim right to try puts the patients and their doctor back in charge of their treatment decisions, which as someone who, has a passion for history of medicine bothers me because really the only time we've ever had doctors and patients in charge of treatment decisions with no interference from anybody, no restriction of drugs, no restrictions of, this is the doctor you can see, this is, the hospital you can go to, was really like the patent medicine era, pre-effective medicines and the FDA. And personally, I don't want to go back to that era. So anyway, I'll stop dissecting this slide and move forward to say, expanded access, how does it actually work? Has anyone in this room ever used it other than Bob? Okay, a couple people. So it starts with a physician. A patient, no matter how motivated, cannot be the one to start this request. You can suggest it to your physician, but your physician has to be the one who contacts the company that is developing the product and say, hey, I have a patient. They don't qualify for your clinical trial. There's nothing else out there that's approved or in trials that will help them, and I'd like to use your drug. What do you say? The company can say yes. And at that point, we continue on down this ladder, or the company can say no. And, that's sort of what we saw in Josh Hardy, was the company saying no, at which point the only sort of, venue left for the parents were to try to pressure the company to change their mind. The government, the FDA, like no other entity can turn to the company and say, sorry, you have to give access. If the company says yes, then there is a process at the FDA whereby the proposed treatment is sent to the FDA for review. As I mentioned, this is generally pretty quick. And then finally, the IRB is involved. Now, IRBs typically look at research, not treatment, and compassionate use is treatment, not research. But the idea is that because there's going to be a consent process, because there's investigational medicine, some entity needed to be empowered to make sure that, the ethics of this were all on board. And the FDA said, well, that's not our problem. And the company said, well, we're not really the ones to be doing that. So that's why IRBs are in there, even though that's really been contentious for decades. And so just to point out again, like the gatekeeper really is the company. Now you have right to try, and right to try said, we are going to get power back to the patients, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to cut out the FDA and the IRB. This is going to be just the doctor and the patient working in tandem. Well, they didn't mention the company, and the company is the gatekeeper. So when Richard Plotkin, first sent me this proposed legislation and said, maybe this is what would help, pretty quickly I was able to say, it's a proposed solution that doesn't actually address the problem. The problem is companies say no, sometimes more than we would want them to do, sometimes very appropriately. But this does not address that. And furthermore, we had already had a legal case that upheld the idea that companies get to decide that there is no right to an investigational drug unless the company decides to give its product away. This was Abigail Burroughs, who had a case very similar to Josh Hardy, and this actually happened in the 90s and at University of Virginia, if any of you recognize those columns, which is where I was doing my first Master's of Bioethics program. So this is why I got involved in this issue, is because this was happening on my campus. And so when Josh Hardy came around decades later, I thought, have we not solved this yet? It had sort of gotten away from me for a bit, but then it came back very clearly that we had not solved this. But regardless of, my thoughts on the matter, political events being what they are, we now have a right to try law. The Goldwater Institute, got their law passed first on state levels in most states. I think Pennsylvania has one, yes? Yes. And then in May 30th, 2018, it became a federal law. And you can see Trump here hugging one of the people who is named in this act. And I just want to point out, This little boy, Jordan McLean, who is one of the namesakes of the bill, by the very definition of the bill, he does not qualify for right to try because you are required to have a life-threatening illness that you are not eligible for clinical trials. And he has Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which, yes, is a life-threatening illness at some point, but for a long period of time is a chronic life-limiting disease. So you could argue on that. But more importantly, he's eligible for clinical trials. So, you know, he was an acute, photogenic, sympathetic patient that was deployed in an attempt to pass this law, even though this law currently does not have any implications for him. And so when the law was being debated, many patient groups actually said, we don't want this. We like the current system. We like having oversight. We like knowing that patients aren't going to get scammed by, you know, a doctor or a drug company who are just looking to be able to sell their unapproved products to whatever price patients are willing to pay. There were some patient advocacy groups that supported the law, but most of them didn't. That being said, most pharmaceutical companies were silent. I think Merck, as like the footnote of some other press release, put out a statement saying, you know, we don't plan on offering products through right to try. As far as I'm aware, that was the only drug company that like sort of proactively said anything. But if you talk to them behind the scenes, they would say, you know, we don't want this. Yeah. You are reading my mind because that's where we're going right here. So only one company in the lead up to this vote had said, yes, if right to try passes, we are going to make our products available. This was a stem cell based company in the ALS space. And they said, you know, we cannot afford to provide our products through expanded access because, to answer your question, in expanded access, there is a requirement that you only pass on direct cost of the drug. So if it costs me $5,000 to make a drug, I can charge a patient $5,000, maybe, you know, plus $100 or something for like shipping and handling and monitoring, but I can't profit from it. There was no such stipulation in right to try. Right to try, it was completely open as to how much a company could charge. And this company said, we cannot afford to use expanded access to make our product available to the patients who are begging us for it. We wish we could, but we can't. We don't have the money. But if we can charge a profit, then yes, we will make it publicly available. So you can see the headline, Brainstorm Moles making modest profits from providing unproven cell therapy on a right to try basis. Once this got picked up in the press and the idea that, you know, ALS dying patients would basically be charged a market rate for something that was not proven for either safety or efficacy, it didn't go over very well, and Brainstorm decided it was not actually going to do that. And as it was not actually going to try to profit from it, it also was not going to be providing its product to right to try. So it had actually really galvanized quite a vocal collection of ALS advocates to push for this law. And then when the law passed, the company said, you know, well, given that there was like this last minute change saying that we can't profit from this, that we're held to the same direct reimbursement rules as expanded access, sorry, we're not actually going to make it available, except for we are going to make it available to the one person whose name is actually mentioned in the law, who actually lives in this state. And just to give you an example of how this happened, you know, impacted in real life, this is an article from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about the Missouri state law. So this is before the federal law was passed, but when states were passing their own laws. My dad had hoped for the first time since diagnosed with ALS when he found out Missouri was a right to try state, Connor said. He thought that because he was moving back to Missouri, he could try this drug. Bardone's neurologist tried to get more information about the drug, and the family made emotional requests to the company. Genevron, however, refused to provide it. Again, company gatekeeper. After months of trying, the family is disappointed and frustrated, and Bob Bardone's health is worsening. Can you imagine the hope we felt, Connor said? This entire process puts the most emotional time in our lives on an even more emotional roller coaster. And right after the law was passed, there was this article in the press saying, you know, the quote, cruel joke of compassionate use and right to try. You don't have a right to try. You have a right to ask. You already had that right to ask through expanded access, and you are asking the company, it's up to the company, and they do not have to say yes. And so this led once again to, we're going to go to the public square and try to pressure people to get access for our child. So this is again change.org for the same family that was in this article. The company denied their request, and so they said, we need to turn to the public square. And when you go to the public square to try to rally people behind your cause, there's fatigue. I mean, there's only so many of these cases that people really rally behind. So, the vast majority of these get, a number of thousand of signatures. This one got more than most, but they don't really go anywhere. And they're certainly not enough to pressure companies into providing things in most circumstances. The Josh Hardy situation was quite extreme. So, right to try, the reality. I'm not going to go through all this, but I'm just going to say we know of on the order of about 10 people who have gotten access to a drug through right to try in the year plus since it's been passed. Now, keep in mind, I said on an average year for expanded access, we have 1,000 plus requests, and each of those requests is not necessarily equal to one patient. So the numbers are pretty overwhelmingly that expanded access is more likely to provide access than right to try. But, it's a new law. Maybe people just aren't familiar with it yet. Things could change. But in the meantime, there's just a lot of confusion. I mentioned that a lot of states have state right to try laws, as well as there's this federal right to try law, and they say different things. So even if you were inclined to try to use right to try to get a drug for your patient, it's very confusing in terms of, well, which one of, what part of these laws do I follow? You need a lawyer to figure this out for you. And when you talk to multi-state hospital chains, they go, well, if we're in 7 different states and there's 7 different right to try laws, I mean, what are we supposed to be doing here? So it's not getting a lot of uptick. And the question that I have is, of those less than 10 people who've gotten access, did any of them get something that they would not have been able to get through expanded access? And the only one that I'm aware of is that one ALS patient who got it from Brainstorm when Brainstorm said, we can't do expanded access. We're going to do right to try. Oh, wait, we're not going to do right to try, but we are going to give it to Matt just to thank him for his advocacy. So in that case, I don't think that's a big support for right to try to say, 9 of the other patients could have used the other pathway. So, just to get to the meat of things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bob. Right to try says, with regard to the FDA and the IRB, we don't need them. This is supposed to be a doctor-patient decision. Let's get rid of them. And furthermore, because one of the things that companies are deathly afraid of when it comes to handing out their unapproved drug is that something bad happens to a patient, and it gets reported to the FDA, and then suddenly you find your drug in development that you've spent 10 years and $1 billion trying to bring to market, looked at skeptically by the regulators. So for right to try, the answer to that was, we'll just make sure the FDA never sees that data. So if there's adverse events or other bad consequences, there's no requirement to report them to the FDA. And if the FDA happens to find out about them through some other means, we will make sure regulatorily that they are not able to factor that into their decision as to whether to approve a drug or not, which as someone with a public health background is concerning to me, that we would be approving drugs and deliberately excluding some data telling us that they might have problems. With regard to doctors and companies, at first, Right to Try didn't talk about these at all. It was 100% focused on the FDA. And then I have to say, I blame myself for this, because after yelling at Goldwater for 3 years about the fact, it's the companies, stupid. If you want to do something, you have to deal with the companies. They added in the federal legislation, not the state legislation, okay, we're going to provide liability protection. So if you're a doctor, if you're a hospital, if you're a drug company, if you're anyone involved in any process and something bad happens, unless you were completely negligent, we're going to make sure no one can sue you. And that actually is a feasible idea that could have led to more people, picking up this and utilizing it, except for the fact that if you went back and looked, there had never been a lawsuit in the expanded access setting. So that's basically saying, we're going to tamp down a fear that didn't actually exist. And then again, we're going to make sure the FDA, is not able to use these serious adverse events. So I just want to point out, again, I said that there are, these multiple layers of review. There's physician, there's company, FDA, IRB. We can talk in the Q&A about why a physician may or may not want to help someone get access to an investigational drug outside of a clinical trial. We've talked a little bit about companies already. We've definitely talked about FDA and how it was sort of in the bullseye of the right to try movement. And there's lots of questions about IRBs. Are IRBs slow? Do they hinder the process? If everything else works really well, are things getting stuck at the IRB level? Like my group has tried to do some empirical work on that to figure things out. One of the questions we had is, do IRBs ever say no? Because what's the point of having a blank check if they never say no? And we found out that they do sometimes say no. So there's lots of questions that remain. But in the meantime, those patients who had put their hopes in right to try as going to be able to get them access to something that they wanted desperately and could not get have now moved on. This is Goldwater again, now under the name of Free to Choose. And they have come up with another regulatory fix. And again, you can see we're back to the 80s, saying why won't the US FDA create a parallel track for ALS patients like they did for AIDS patients in the 1980s? Well, they did. That's what expanded access is. And there are other bills floating around out there that we can talk about if people are interested, but basically saying, well, if the problem is that it's expensive, let's let companies charge for the drug. Or if the problem is that, non-trial access is too cumbersome for whatever reason, let's make sure that everyone in a trial gets access to the investigational agent. That's the so-called placebo no more bill. So we need data. We need data to know exactly where the sticking points are, but I think we can say pretty clearly and consistently it wasn't the FDA, which I would have predicted in the first place, and I did predict in the first place, but whatever. And it leads us back to, these three words that I started with, expectations. What are people's expectations of this process? Do they match reality? Can we try to, moderate expectations to something more realistic? How do we do that? We do that through education. Who needs to be educated? Well, doctors need to be educated because they're the ones who push this engine along, and frequently they don't have firsthand experience, or they have experience, we've done it one time. And also patient advocacy organizations, a bunch of other areas where education could be helpful. And then just transparency. One of the things that I found that I was really surprised about is when I talked to pharmaceutical companies about why they were not interested in right to try. It turned out they really liked being able to hide behind the facade of this, overbearing FDA saying no to patients. They're like, that way we don't get the blowback. We say no, but it sort of is hidden behind this, well, we couldn't get it through the FDA. You take the FDA out, it's going to be plainly apparent that we are the ones saying no. So I think I will end there. Just thank the members of my group. The URL is up there, and since it's really long and complicated, I would say just search for NYU Coupa. And I will cede the podium to Bob.
Okay, hi everybody. Let's see. It's all right there. Wow, super high tech. My name's Bob Vonderheide. I bring two perspectives, and first let me thank Allison first for coming from NYU and also for a really wise and clear and understandable description of what right to try is and what it isn't. My perspective is I'm the director of the Abramson Cancer Center, and when this bill passed on a national level, we thought we would get a dam burst of requests. That did not happen in any way. I'll tell you about that. And the second thing is I've spent a great deal of my career running clinical trials. I've enrolled hundreds of patients on clinical trials. And I can tell you from that experience that in all those years of experience, I've never been in a position of greater anger in the room or passion in the room except around the FDA preventing my son, daughter, myself from getting the life-saving drug. It's really intense, and you have to have empathy to see from a patient's perspective why that anger exists. The patients are not wrong. They're incredibly frustrated. The other perspective is that's not just anger. Sometimes it's incredible passion. I remember a patient a few years ago who had advanced stage melanoma. We were giving the patient an immunotherapy combination, and I went in to see him to tell him the results were bad from the clinical trial. The tumor was progressing, and but that was okay. We were going to find Plan B. And he looked at me and he said, this was Plan B. And in fact, we didn't have a Plan C. There was nothing else, and he died shortly thereafter. And so you can see that patients with advanced cancer find themselves in this position. Now, right to try doesn't apply just to cancer, but given where cancer has been and where it's going in the last few years, with the role of new experimental therapies becoming FDA approved, that's why we anticipated such a demand. Let me put that in perspective. So the FDA in the last 2 years has approved about 100 new oncology indications for new drugs and approaches. Here at the Abramson Cancer Center, we've been involved in 9 of those. So you can do the math real quick. We're proud of that because it's mission critical for us to advance novel ideas into clinical trials and make them available not just to patients on those clinical trials, but to anybody where the drug can be prescribed. We enroll about 4,600 subjects on interventional clinical trials. That's twice as high as it was 5 years ago. Of those, about a third are treatment trials, novel treatments, most of which are medical, but not exclusively. So what has changed, at least in my career over the last 20 years, is that there's a greater and greater understanding of patients. What is a clinical trial? There's a greater demand for experimental therapeutics. Within cancer, there's greater and greater hope that those experimental drugs will one day become real therapies, and it's an opportunity to receive tomorrow's therapies today. This is why there's such an issue, and where I can see how right to try appeared to be the solution. I think Allison said it best. It's not a solution, but the problem does exist, which is gaining access. And I think you said this phrase as well. It's really not a right to try. It doesn't give that patient or a family that absolute right. It's actually right to ask, which we had that right all along. And the problem, I mentioned the problem is not the patients. The problem is not the FDA. And I'll go through that in a second. Not at all. Certainly in the cancer world, we work with them extremely closely. In fact, I want the FDA involved. They know more data about experimental therapeutics than anybody because it goes through them. As soon as we loop them out of the process, we're going to make mistakes. And here at Penn, the problem is not our IRB. Maybe 25 years ago, we struggled, but we don't struggle anymore. In fact, we've accelerated in the cancer world our ability to activate trials by 50% in 5 years because this is mission critical. So at the time this bill was passed, we formed a council. I think we called it a blue ribbon panel just to impress ourselves, of folks and stakeholders in the Cancer Center. And Holly and I worked together, and Steve, to get folks together to talk about right to try and what this would mean for patients and what would our response be should a patient ask, a cancer patient. And the decision was made not to promulgate any hard and fast rules, but to see how this played out. What did happen is that under Holly's leadership, and I joined as an author on this paper, these guidelines or these recommendations for how to approach right to try in the oncology world, we published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology last year. This is table 1 from that paper, and you can see some of the thoughts. Because as Allison said, this comes back to the patient's physician having a discussion with the patient about will we or will we not pursue these options, right to try, or expanded access, or clinical trial, or standard of care, which includes at times end-of-life care, hospice care. And some of the important points are to help educate patients around the appropriateness of clinical and research alternatives, and in particular to consider using the FDA's Project Facilitate. Do people know about Project Facilitate? You guys do. Anyone else heard of it? A few people. Megan, of course, has heard of it. This was started, and it's an oncology-focused thing to the best of my knowledge, where the FDA will partner with any physician who wants to try to find access for a drug for a patient and simplify the process and provide basically 24/7 emergency consultation where they'll work through the forms with you. Now, 2 years ago, they had about 100 folks actually go through the process, and last year was about 140. So that's the demand, and that's the knowledge. But here at Penn, we don't have Project Facilitate, but we have issued guidelines to our clinicians, our oncologists, to say if a patient is interested in gaining access to a drug by way of expanded access, which is our preferred format if there's no clinical trial, how to do it and make it as simple as possible. And we provide essentially 7-day-a-week consult to physicians. It's a burden. It's a burden to physicians, and they have only a few minutes to see all their patients, and we want to make it as simple as possible. It does come down to the company saying yes. If the manufacturer says no, it's over. So when we think about where the problem is, I don't want to say, oh, companies are these horrible things. They've created a lot of life-saving drugs. But let's think about it from a company's perspective. Why would they be hesitant? Is that an issue? Or how do we run our clinical trials? Are there opportunities? So a few very important things that came out of this discussions were not to ever be in a position where we rubber stamp right to try. These decisions are the output of a physician-doctor relationship and need to be that way. Also, particularly in my role as director of the Cancer Center, I occasionally get emails saying, get me this drug, from someone I don't know. So that is not a patient-doctor relationship. I say to those folks, come to Penn, we'll see you. We may have lots of options. And so be careful, we warn our physicians, about going beyond what is a physician-doctor relationship. And you can read these other considerations. Seeking expertise from the FDA is really important. As I said, they have a database larger than anyone. And if this would ever go forward as a right to try and collect data and information and make that publicly available. Most important thing is for our physicians to share in decision-making with patients. So how did we go forward? What did we decide to do at the Abramson Cancer Center? And these are 3 approaches that we've chosen and so far seem to be working out. The first is to educate our physicians about what is right to try, to educate everyone about the difference between right to try, expanded access, clinical trial, and routine therapy, and also our patients. And so these are very common conversations. We also get inquiries from folks because we're outward facing on our website, and we have new patient officers, and we have our clinical trials are posted on the web, that there's a number of folks who are not physicians or nurses who are receiving requests from patients about, I see you have a trial with that drug. Well, I don't have that cancer, but I want it. So we've educated that group of people about what really are the options. Usually the discussion of what drug will I have for this horrible cancer is one between your physician and the patient. And within that, we don't know how many times right to try has come up. We hear not very often. Patients are very interested in clinical trials. They are sometimes interested in expanded access. We hear very little that right to try comes up. When we get a request from someone who is quite adamant about right to try, and they are not a patient of ours, those are handled on a case-by-case basis by the Cancer Center's Associate Director of Clinical Research, who will get involved and talk to the patient and explain different considerations, including coming to Penn and becoming our patient to learn about all the options. We are a manufacturer of drugs at the ACC. We do hold INDs for drugs and biologics that are made here. The one you probably know the best is cellular therapeutics, many of which are now FDA approved, but we have lots of those compounds that are manufactured here on campus. We have some other types of drugs that way. In general, those are available only on clinical trials. Expanded access can be considered, but it's a very rare thing. We are focusing on clinical trials. We think that is the right way to go. And we have not decided as a cancer center or as a health system to offer those drugs by way of right to try, because there we are the manufacturer, where it all comes down to will you permit the drug or not. And I think we've seen success in cellular and gene therapy by being incredibly rigorous about how those drugs are studied, and to do them through a clinical trial is the policy today. So I'll finish there. And again, thanks, Allison, for coming.
About 5 minutes left for questions.
So Janssen Pharmaceuticals has as a policy it will not consider right to try. Any requests that come in, they tell them up front, we're only going to go through expanded access. Pfizer does the same. So there are companies that will say no, and then there are companies that will say no explicitly. I only know of 2 companies at this point that have said yes, and they were the ones I talked about. You mean for expanded access? So what the places that we don't have data is we don't have, as you're saying, we don't have any idea how many doctors and patients discuss this, and it just falls by the wayside. And that's the first step, right? Then we don't have any idea how many doctors contact drug companies, and drug companies say no, and it falls by the wayside. We have no idea. The only data we have is when the company says yes, and then it goes to the FDA, because FDA has public records. And so it's somewhere in the order of about 1,500 requests per year. And remember, those requests can be for single patients or they can be for whole groups of patients. And out of the FDA, we know that they approve upward of 90% of the requests that come to them, because basically they say, you know, if the company is comfortable and if the doctor is comfortable, as long as we don't see any obvious safety concerns, we're going to be okay with it. We do know that about 11% of the requests that go to FDA get modified. You know, they'll say like, you know, that dosage is no good, or really you need into the plan, you need to add cardiac monitoring or something. But so we know the FDA approves the vast majority of those requests, but prior to the FDA, we have no idea sort of what the denominator versus numerator is.
I mentioned Project Facilitate in cancer, and actually they just updated their data last month. They have never said no. The rejection rate is 0 when the company, the physician, and the patients are united.
I'd be interested in both of your perspectives, areas where there might be room to improve. Put right to try to the side, and let's focus just on the better of the 2 pathways. What else is necessary?
You want to go or you want me to go?
I want you to go.
So on the train here, I got an email from a cancer center on the East Coast saying, we have a request for expanded access. We've never done it. Can you help us? People shouldn't be emailing me. There should be some designated point of, you know, if you're a physician or if you're an academic medical center, here's where you get your knowledge. And it can be expanded, it can be Project Facilitate in the cancer arena, but Project Facilitate is oncology specific. There's nothing like that outside. So, I mean, we really need to have something other than people randomly emailing me.
So we tried to make it very simple for our physicians to know exactly what to do so that our physicians don't have to email Allison, although hopefully that'd be okay if they did. But so that's one thing. The second thing is, is there a possibility to advance precision medicine by way of expanded access? So it is unlikely for all types of rare cancers that there'll be a clinical trial for everybody, even though we're doing a lot of umbrella trials and so forth. And so we've kicked around this idea, could we create a consortium with companies where if we were able to identify a rare mutation and knew company X had a drug for that, or another mutation and another company had X, there'd be no way to have 100 different clinical trials. But could that happen under expanded access? And the more you think that through, you realize you're doing a clinical trial. So, but you could facilitate the approval in some way faster. We haven't figured out exactly how to do those N-of-1 trials under one umbrella like that, but that is one possibility. The other thing we're, yeah, jump in.
So I'm at FDA tomorrow talking about exactly that. So it's not just, like the cellular therapies for oncology, it's phage therapy. I mean, it's any number of these sort of bespoke, individualized things right now. They tend to be happening through expanded access, and the idea is, what can we do to make that more streamlined?
Let people go since it's one, but Karen, you should come up, obviously, to answer your questions. Thank you very much to our speakers.
Thanks, Al.
And great talk.
Yeah, I didn't know that.